Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. These webinar series deliver topics pertinent to beef and sheep producers. My name is Hilary and I work for the Webinar Coordinators Aggregate Consulting. Tonight's topic is Maximising lamb growth pre and post weaning with Tom Keogh at CSU. Just a bit of housekeeping to start with. This control panel should be at the top right corner of your screen. There is a red arrow at the top left hand corner of the control panel which collapses and reinstates it. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. As Tom is giving his presentation tonight, please type the questions in the box provided and I will relay them to him at the end of the webinar. Please make the questions as succinct as possible so we can get through them the best of our ability. Okay, good. I'll get Tom's bio up. So we welcome a new presenter tonight in Tom Keogh. Tom completed a Bachelor of Animal Science and is currently completing his PhD at Charles Sturt University through the Graham Centre and Fred Morley Centre. Tom is researching all things lamb growth with a focus on feedlotting, supervised by Bruce Allworth, Sean McGrath and Hutton Oddie. And we are also actually joined by Bruce tonight, just in case of, just for question time, but we might not even hear from him because we can all vouch for Tom. Tom is obviously well versed in lamb production, having worked in various sheep and cattle commercial farms since leaving school 8 years ago. It's great to have Tom with us this evening, and I will make Tom the presenter to get started.
Have you got me, Hilary?
I do. Looks good. Thanks, Tom.
Okay. So yeah, thanks for that. I'll be presenting on maximising lamb growth. And my aim is to just pass on some practical information to help you make decisions about how to optimise lamb growth on your farm. Nothing I'm presenting is going to be new or revolutionary, and I certainly don't have the secret formula that I'm sure a lot of you have come here for. Most of this stuff's pretty straightforward and well known, but hopefully you get something out of it. So a quick outline. I'll quickly explain what lamb growth is and what it looks like. I'll then try and cover what we can do prior to weaning, and I'll have a focus on creep feeding. And then I'll cover different weaning management practices. And then finally, the bit I find most interesting, which is optimising post-weaning growth, and I'll look at both on pasture and in a feedlot. The key messages are that live weight and live weight gain are not reliable predictors of performance, and that's especially over short periods. Creep feeding has a role in certain situations, but benefits will vary due to a number of factors. Seasonal conditions will change when and how you wean, so don't lock in your weaning date just yet. Maximising growth on pasture is as simple as having good management with the possible addition of supplements when feed quality declines. And maximising growth in a feedlot involves getting over two major hurdles, the first of which is the adaptation period, and the second is achieving maximum energy intake. So I thought I would start by sharing some of my own personal lambs growth rates. So these were born in June this year, and possibly some important background information is I only own 45 lambs and my mature ewes are about 100 kilos. So if you're getting similar average weaning weights to me at this sort of age, I'm guessing your shearers aren't that excited to come to your place. So at 115 days old, these lambs were weaned, and the singles were 54 kilos and the twins 46.5 kilos. So that made their pre-weaning growth rates 418 and 359 grams from birth to this point. The lambs were weighed 18 days post-weaning, and the singles were 63.7, twins 55.8. And this made their growth rates for these 18 days over 500 grams per day. So if my understanding of how lamb grows is correct, these growth rates are pretty unlikely. But luckily, I also happened to weigh them just 3 days post-weaning. And at 3 days post-weaning, the singles were 60.9, the twins 52.7, meaning they put on over 6 kilograms for these 3 days and a growth rate of over 2 kilograms a day. This means from day 4 to 18 post-weaning, they grew at around 200 grams per day, which is much closer to the growth rates I would have expected. So why did they put on so much weight for these 3 days? Well, I would guess that if I killed these single lambs at weaning here, I'd have a dressing percentage of about 50% and a carcass weight of 27 kilos. If I then waited 3 days and killed the same lambs when they weighed 7 kilograms more, I would be no richer because I would still have a carcass weight of 27 kilos, but now a dressing percentage of only 44%. So my lambs were weaned earlier than I probably needed to. There was plenty of high quality feed available. The ewes were as fat as they could be, and they were producing plenty of milk for the lambs. The lambs would have been eating grass, but a high proportion of their energy intakes were likely being met from milk. So following weaning, the lambs lost that favorite energy source and they had to eat. And they were put on pretty high digestible pasture, and they were clearly eating plenty of it because it's pretty likely that their rumen size and gut contents was the reason that they rapidly increased their weight for those 3 days. So a change in live weight is a result of a number of things. Preferably, it's that the animal has deposited more muscle, carcass fat, or even increased its bone weight, because this is what we get paid for. This is our carcass percentage and our dressing percentage and our carcass. But other things that can change are the size of their organs and their gut contents, and these are influenced by feed intake. Furthermore, the lamb could deposit more internal fat or grow more wool. The problem with all of this is it actually makes live weight a pretty unreliable predictor of lamb performance, unless the weights are recorded over a significant time period. And I'd recommend at least 6 weeks as your minimum. So my message is that when you see reports of growth rates due to certain management practices or even certain genetics, before you invest in these, perhaps consider what else could be influencing these results and whether there is satisfactory evidence to support any of those claims. I stole this from a paper one of my supervisors just sent to me the other day, and it shows ram number 6, which was his name, and from 3 days of age to 1 year, his daily intake was recorded. What you can see here is that daily intake varies quite substantially, and it's not constant over a 24-hour period. It's actually only constant over a number of days, 3, 4, 5 days. When gut contents can make up to 15% of a lamb's live weight, so for a 40-kilo lamb, that's 6 kilos, you can see the issue with live weight if the animal has had one of these hibernation days the day prior. So when you weigh a large sample of a mob over a substantial period, this effect is obviously reduced. But weighing lambs every fortnight is a great way to have more data to analyse, but don't analyse it until you have about 6 weeks worth. In a perfect world, a lamb would follow a growth curve that looks a little something like this. And if I had a lamb on pasture and it was following this curve, growing as fast as it can, but I decided to feed a grain supplement here at day 50, the lamb is not going to grow like this. What is much more likely to happen if I introduce this grain supplement too quickly, I'd decrease his rumen pH and he would slow his intake and he would grow like this. Now, the reason they follow this growth curve is because they and can't grow any faster than it is because there isn't enough available energy for them to grow any faster. Why is this the case? Because there is a biological constraint on feed intake. An immature lamb can't eat very much, but their maintenance requirements are quite small and they're storing a greater amount of energy in protein, which has a lower energy concentration per kilogram. As lambs mature, they approach this maximum feed intake. They also have increased increased maintenance requirements, and most of the energy they are storing is in fat, which is much more expensive. And the result is that growth rate slows. This means that feed conversion also declines, as they will be eating greater quantities per kilogram of weight gain. So unless your lambs have been severely restricted prior to weaning, or you've weaned your lambs particularly young, the growth rates of your lambs up until weaning are likely to be the best that you will achieve. Some data from the information nucleus flock in Keogh shows what is typical of lamb growth. Up until weaning, it is relatively easy to get lambs to follow the expected daily gain, the predicted daily gain. Then at weaning, which is indicated by those red data points, the growth rates start to drop pretty dramatically and they don't ever get back to where they should be. So in a decent year, there isn't actually a whole lot you can do to increase pre-weaning growth rate, because with a good supply of their mother's milk and some high quality feed, pre-weaning growth is actually really efficient. But obviously this isn't always the case. So we can have a look at some reasons why you might want to supplement lambs whilst they're still suckling their mums. So creep feeding, I think, is an excellent way to ensure lambs have access to high quality feed, and it excludes the ewes, so it reduces that competition. Well, it gets rid of that competition, which is great. So if the feed is available to your lambs is greater than 70% digestible and greater than 1,500 kilograms per hectare green, then it probably isn't going to make a great deal of difference. The lambs have already got everything they need right in front of them, and the ewes are probably producing plenty of milk. But even if they aren't, a feeder's not going to provide anything better than what you've got in your pasture. Young green pastures are the most digestible, and a greater legume content will increase digestibility. So an ideal pasture would contain about 30% legumes. Digestibility is directly related to energy. So a high energy density is high digestibility. And you can see here that if you're lambing from May to August, somewhere in there, by the time your pasture is making up a decent proportion of intake, which is about 6 weeks of age for a lamb, most of the time it's going to be about that 70% digestibility. And you've got your sown perennials and legumes at the top of this curve, and your volunteer annuals and native grasses at the bottom. But you can see here that digestibility really starts to drop from sort of October. So where you should start considering creep feeding is when you don't have this sort of feed available. But there's still a few more things we need to consider. So if your lambs are less than 6 weeks old, they're unlikely to be getting a high proportion of nutrients from solid feed, and ewes tend to be able to compensate their milk production by using their fat stores up until about 6 weeks, irrespective of feed on offer. When the lambs are older than 6 weeks and feed is limiting, the ewes will reduce their milk production and outcompete lambs for any feed that is available. So creep feeding is really useful in this sort of situation. But I'd also suggest you have a listen to Bruce's webinar earlier this year about when to wean lambs. Because in summary, from about 8 weeks of age, if your feed is limiting and you have the ability to provide lambs with better nutrition, your best option is most likely going to be to wean. Most of this slide's pretty basic, but it's still a good reminder if you need to prioritise your available feed. So creep feeding is most likely going to benefit ewes rearing more lambs, as would be expected, because they can't produce as much milk for each lamb. Similarly, I'm not having a dig at merinos, but typically they aren't gifted with exceptional milk producing abilities. And the first cross ewe, she's half a merino, so she has that to bring her down. Composites, their milk producing ability will depend on the breeds that make it up. And the East Friesian, obviously not so common, but it illustrated that I was talking about their capacity to produce milk. Mature ewes and ewes in good condition also obviously produce more milk than maidens or ewes losing condition. So if you're sitting there trying to work out which mob to creep feed, I'd start by targeting your maiden merinos that are rearing quads. And if that doesn't work, I don't know what will. If you've seen any information about creep feeding lambs, you've probably also seen this image. And it illustrates how creep feeding can rapidly develop the rumen. And all these images are taken at 6 weeks of age from calves. So there's 2 reasons that this doesn't apply particularly well to sheep. Firstly, this experiment was designed to investigate the best management of hand-reared dairy calves for early weaning. So in this system, milk intake is controlled. If you restrict milk intake, this will force animals to consume solid feed. And this obviously is much simpler with hand-reared calves than sheep in a paddock. Secondly, the rumen begins developing when solid feed enters it as a result of the production of volatile fatty acids. So a poorly digestible diet will not produce as many volatile fatty acids as a highly digestible diet. So image 2 shows a rumen that is only very slightly developed. However, I guess just from looking at this rumen that the hay that was provided was not incredibly high in digestibility, or the calf simply wasn't consuming much of it. The more developed rumen is a result of an animal that has consumed a highly digestible feed source, which is always available with pasture in an average or better year. By 2 weeks of age, lambs raised on grass actually show quite substantial rumen development. So the point is that yes, creep feeding grain will develop the rumen, and this could be really useful with low feed availability, but similarly, decent quality pasture will also do this. But there's even more to this story. Feeding a grain diet lowers the rumen pH, creating an environment that favours microbes that produce the volatile fatty acid propionate. The microbes responsible for the digestion of grass and production of acetate, which is another volatile fatty acid, require a less acidic rumen environment, and they're killed off with this low rumen pH environment. So creep feeding a grain diet could be a potential advantage if the lambs are being fed grain post-weaning. The advantage being you're adapting the rumen to this diet that they will be consuming, and you're making the lambs familiar with this feed source. Feeding grain pre-weaning and then weaning onto pasture is not going to be beneficial in adapting the rumen, because whatever changes the rumen makes to prepare for a grain diet, they're not necessary post-weaning. In an experiment I did last year, I found there was no apparent benefit in feed intake or growth rates from creep feeding lambs before they entered the feedlot. It'd be much more interesting to do this in a tough year when lambs are likely to be much more reliant on the grain before they entered the feedlot pre-weaning. So hopefully that's covered the basic decision making for whether to creep feed or not. I know I haven't really covered how to creep feed, but there's no one method for this. The amount of grain you want the lambs to eat will depend on your pasture availability, the age of the lambs, and the condition of the ewes. There's no best method for creep feeding, and it's basically whatever works, whatever you can do. The aim is to exclude the ewes, obviously, thus eliminating competition for feed. You can see here I just used some old cattle panels that had rails that were 25 centimetres apart and put them on their side. And a similar method could be used really effectively between 2 paddocks to allow your lambs to creep graze. Okay, on to weaning. Some quick definitions for weaning so there's no confusion. Early weaning is simply weaning young, small lambs which are younger than 12 weeks of age. Yard weaning is weaning into a confined area, so you've got total control over the diet. And then early yard weaning would be weaning young lambs into this confined area. Early weaning. I think early weaning is a great management strategy when feed is limiting. Again, I would direct you to Bruce's webinar earlier this year. As for early weaning reducing stress, I haven't seen the evidence to support this, so I put a question mark there. What I do know is that lambs are highly efficient at growing prior to weaning, so I would suspect that any reduction in stress would probably not outweigh this, and hence the 3 question marks. Now, will early weaning be beneficial to develop the rumen? Well, yes, I agree early weaning will develop the rumen, but so will late weaning or not weaning at all. There's plenty of producers that wean on an exact date every year, and there's no issue in doing that, especially if it simplifies things, it works for your system. If you've got something else going on and you need to just get them done. I did it myself this year because I'd prefer to do it too early than too late. But as for reports of lambs having the same growth rates that are weaned early as others that are still on their mums, obviously this will depend on a number of factors, but all things being equal, I think this is pretty unlikely. I would suspect that any data suggesting this probably isn't allowing for the other components of live weight, and once both groups are weaned, there probably would be a difference. Once I see some CT scans to back this data up, you might be able to convince me otherwise. But I see the greatest advantage in early weaning is looking after your ewes in a tough year. Yard weaning. Weaning into a yard is a great way to provide the necessary nutrients for lambs, especially if you don't otherwise have that feed available. If done well, it has the benefit of providing a high quality diet and you can give unrestricted access. You do need to remember that it will take 2 to 3 weeks for lambs to adapt to this sort of diet, and during that period, lamb growth rates can often be quite slow. Creep feeding has the potential to reduce this period, but close attention needs to be paid to intake prior to weaning. You can't suddenly feed out 500 grams per head if they've only been consuming 50 grams per head pre-weaning. Well, yeah, you could, but I wouldn't do it. There isn't as much research into yard weaning lambs as there is calves, but the evidence suggests that there's no significant benefit for lambs. It's unlikely to reduce the stress of weaning, mainly because you're adding in an extra stress of having to adapt to a new diet. Weaning into a yard could be beneficial if the lambs are going to be fed in a feedlot because it gets them adapted and starts them eating, but if they're getting weaned into a yard and then put on a paddock 3 weeks later, it's not likely there's going to be any benefit. Another option could be weaning onto grass and providing access to grain or feeding out grain before entering the feedlot. So I also did this in a trial last year, and lambs weaned onto pasture with access to grain. They grew faster post-weaning than lambs that entered the feedlot directly at weaning. And also when the lambs that were weaned onto pasture entered the feedlot, they were consuming just as much feed and growing just as quickly as those that were weaned straight into the feedlot. Now, post-weaning. Maximising post-weaning growth in theory is really straightforward, but in practice, it's easily the most difficult. The most important thing to remember, well, this is the way I like to think about it, is that a lamb will eat approximately 3.5% to 4% of its live weight. So this is your upper limit for success. So to make the most of this, we first need to know what they need to grow. And by far, the most important thing is metabolizable energy. Energy is the key nutrient that limits the production of lambs, and it's the greatest demand by tissues of a growing animal. Adequate protein is the next most important, and vitamin and mineral requirements also need to be met. But in my opinion, protein, vitamins, and minerals seem to get much more attention than they deserve when energy is the key. High quality pastures, they are energy dense, they don't require an adaptation period, and most of the time they don't need additional protein, vitamins, and minerals. Cereal grains, they're really useful when pasture isn't available or of high enough quality. And they're the most energy dense ruminant feeds, but they don't contain an ideal concentration of protein or minerals. So how do we maximize energy intake on pasture? The most effective way is to manage your pastures in the active growth stage and pray for it to keep raining. But plan B is to supplement. But this is only necessary if your feed is not of high enough quality. If we provide supplements on a high quality feed, it will result in substitution, where the lambs will reduce their pasture intake to allow for the supplement intake. Remember, they can only eat 3.5% to 4% of their live weight. So this has the potential to result in poor utilization of feed if your stocking rates are low, but if your stocking rates are high, there is potential for better pasture utilization. This probably won't improve your growth rates, but it will increase the number of lambs that are utilizing that green feed while it's there and available. On lower quality feed, if you're providing supplements and wondering how much to provide, your first step is to probably do a feed test of your pasture and perhaps do multiple feed tests so you can see how that declines over time. If your energy content of the pasture is low, you'll need to supplement the lambs more. And something that's really useful for that is the drought and supplementary feed calculator. It's just a free app on your phone, and you can hit in exactly what your digestibility is, exactly what your pasture height is, and it will tell you what your lambs need to grow at X rate. And in fact, if you put in that your pasture is 70% digestible and greater than 1,500 kilos, it will tell you not to provide any supplement. So you can see here the relationship between digestibility, pasture availability, and growth rates. So for maximum growth rates, we need at least 1,500 kilograms per hectare of green available. And then if you look here at the digestibility curve, so at 70% digestibility and 1,500 kilos, you're looking at that 250 grams per day, which it should be your target, really. Now, for every 5% that your digestibility drops, you're losing over 50 grams per day. And And if you want to know when digestibility starts to drop, it's this early to mid flowering stage. So you need to do a feed test around that time. Maximising intake in the feedlot. The intake of cereal grains and therefore energy, it's initially limited by the ability of the lambs to adapt to both the diet and the feeding system. So behavioural adaptation is of equal importance to the physiological adaptation, and behavioural includes acclimatising to the feed, the feeding equipment and the social structure. Livestock often display fear of the new, which most people would know, and it can take a number of days before a stable intake is achieved in this sort of environment. Lambs are also very sensitive, and they will take a number of days to revisit a feed source that's previously upset them. So this is just an evolutionary adaptation that lambs have to avoid toxic plants, and the same will happen if you introduce grain too quickly. Dominance and bullying is another issue, and this is shown to be positively correlated with age and body size. So most people are aware of this. Making the most practical solution to this issue is putting lambs in similar age and weight groups. Now, physiological adaptation, that's important for the obvious reasons. It maximises digestibility and minimises the losses, the risk of acidosis. Despite a well-conducted adaptation period, lambs can take some time to reach an acceptable intake and growth rate. So a really effective way to know how your lambs are adapting to the diet is try and monitor that intake, especially around the 3 and 4 weeks in the feedlot. So if you're getting 3.5 to 4% of live weight intake by the end of the 3rd week, you've normally had a pretty good adaptation period. Another way to monitor this is by monitoring the feces. So a firmer, more formed pellet means they've adapted and they're efficiently digesting the feed. So if you've got both high intake and really formed pellets, you've done a really good job. The next step is to work out what exactly the lambs are eating. So a possible limitation to the popular self-feeder system, self-feeder feedlot, is allowing lambs to select their own diet. Some lambs may eat mostly straw with a little bit of grain. Others may eat only grain, putting themselves at risk of acidosis. Others may change their mind every day. So in the blue here is an example of a self-feeder system, and this lamb is eating 30% straw and of low quality, only 6 megajoules, and 70% of a grain ration. So what this lamb is actually consuming is not what is written on the packet of the expensive ration. It's actually 10.2 megajoules and 12.4% crude protein, and that translates to about 170 to 180 grams per day. Now, if I fed a total mixed ration where I only allowed the lambs to have 10% 10% fiber, and it was a high quality fiber, the energy intake increases by 1.5 megajoules, and you can see how that translates to growth. So lambs have to meet their maintenance requirements every day, and any intake above that is growth. So if you can simply add 1 megajoule, 1.5 megajoule, that will translate to quite substantial growth. Additionally, interactions between grain and forage can affect both digestibility and intake. I'm mentioning this because I know someone is thinking that they've solved this problem and they will just simply remove the fiber source and then the lamb will just eat the high energy ration. But the evidence suggests that feeding no fiber will actually decrease your intake due to that low rumen pH, and it also puts the lambs at serious risk of acidosis, which will make them less efficient at digesting their feed. So the current recommendations for at least 10% fiber inclusion in the diet. So now we have the lambs eating as much energy as possible. We just have to double check they're getting enough protein. And a good guide is 12.5 grams of crude protein per megajoule of ME. So this goes back to working out what that lamb's actually eating, and probably also involves feed testing your ration. Inadequate protein in the diet will limit feed intake and result in growth. So it might surprise some people that it's not a hard and fast rule of 16% or 18% crude protein being necessary for lamb growth. This table shows that if your energy content's only 10 megajoules, you actually only need 13% crude protein and you're going to be no worse off. Actually, you'll be better off because the protein is such an expensive part of the ration. Vitamins and minerals I won't get too in depth with, because unless you have a known deficiency, there's only a few things you need to be aware of. The main point I will make is that excess inclusions of these are not necessary and could end up causing you more problems. So make sure you meet requirements, but it's not necessary to have 3 different types of sodium and 4 different rumen buffers just to be safe. I'd sooner recommend that every lamb is handed one of these at induction. Almost every diet, grain diet, is going to be low in calcium and sodium. So you need to definitely check your calcium, your sodium, your calcium phosphorus ratio needs to be between 1:1 and 2:1. Your sodium deficiency could be met by your water supply, especially if it's bore water. So that could be something worth checking. When it comes to buffers, there are more products than I have time to mention. And most of those work, but none of them will do the job of a well-managed adaptation period. Some other minerals worth mentioning are selenium and cobalt. Selenium won't be a problem for a short feeding period unless the lambs are deficient prior to feedlot entry, and vaccinations and drenches often contain selenium. Cobalt isn't actually required by ruminants, but it's required by microbes that synthesize vitamin B12. So if you have adequate cobalt in your diet, you won't actually need a vitamin B12 injection. Cobalt is also a commonly added ingredient to drenches, but if you feed test your ration and you have adequate selenium and cobalt, you can relax. If you're feedlotting lambs on a high grain diet, I would definitely recommend feed testing your ration, a 1.5% inclusion of limestone, a 1% inclusion of salt, and a really well managed adaptation period. For your induction or your adaptation, you need to use the Step Up program, and most people are pretty aware of this. The New South Wales DPI has a really good resource. It's just called Feedlotting Lambs. You can see here, if you're doing a total mixed ration, you just change the percentage of hay and concentrate over the period. And then for grain and hay fed separately, you need to be probably more careful, and you need to make sure you know exactly how many head you've got in there and feed out the right amounts each day. And I wouldn't be afraid to push these induction periods out to 18, 20 days, because it does take longer than just 2 weeks for lambs to adapt to this sort of diet. Remember, the initial stages of induction, the energy the lambs are getting from the grain is not going to be very high, especially this first week when they're only getting 100, 250 grams. So a high quality roughage makes a lot of sense. It will keep your lambs eating and putting on weight. And then the final key message is to monitor intake as best you can. I know it's hard when you've got pens of 200, but if you remember that your target is 3.5 to 4% of intake, you'll probably end up doing a pretty good job. So that's all I have, and I'll do my best to answer any questions.
Great, thanks so much, Tom, and a really great presentation, which gave us a lot to think about going into weaning if you haven't already. And I know you said we won't learn anything new, but I'm certain that everyone took something away from that. So thank you. Just to give Tom a bit of a break before we jump into questions. And if you do have any questions, please send them through now in the question box provided. If you do have to head off, thanks for joining us. There is a survey at the end of the webinar that will pop up when you exit the webinar. If we could ask you to take 5 minutes to do the survey, it just provides feedback to MLA, us at Aggregate, and presenters like Tom, just to make sure all the information is relevant and good for you as the audience. So no questions as of yet, so please send them through if you do have any. I've got one to kick us off, Tom. You mentioned the sort of magic dry matter amount of 1,500 kilos a fair bit throughout the presentation. Can you just elaborate around why that is sort of that magic number?
That's just your minimum. So above that is obviously really good. That's just a way to not limit intake. So if they've got that sort of feed in front of them, it means that they're not, running around the paddock looking for feed, and also that there's going to be very little competition with their mum for that feed, because the paddock's essentially covered in feed.
Okay, great. And in terms of, I guess, feeding into pasture species, have you seen any work around what species are more favourable for lamb growth rates that time?
What species are more favourable for lamb growth rates?
Yeah, yep.
Well, your terminals are anything
Sorry,
side by
pasture
terminal.
species.
Pasture species. Geez, I'm not as good on pasture species, but certainly some legume content is going to be really important. I really don't know enough about crops or summer crops, but if you're using something like that, you need to be careful that you're not limiting intake by having something that's too fibrous. So yeah, just I don't know. Bruce, you got any comments on that? Or?
No, I think that's a good response, Tom. So the legume content's obviously very important. It's all right.
Yeah, at least 15%.
Great, thank you. We'll kick off. There's been a few questions come through. So, Tom, is feeding of grains better, or can they be better utilised by both lambs and ewes if they have been crushed or steamed?
This is a very good question. And there's been a fair bit of work on this, and often there's quite mixed results with this sort of work. But a lot of the really good work was done in sort of the 1970s, and when there must have been a serious drought back then. I don't know, I wasn't alive. But they found that no, pretty much crushing grain doesn't make a great deal of difference. Sheep are really good at utilising that grain. Especially if they're ruminating and they're bringing the grains back up and masticating, crushing them. They're really good at utilising grain. They're not like cattle at all who do benefit from steam flaking or crushing.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the question. The next one, is it beneficial to creep feed lambs on high digestible fodder crops like brassica, lucerne, or chicory to make the crop go further?
Yeah, if you can keep your pasture going in that stage where it's an active growth, so you've got a high energy pasture, and if you're putting in creep feeding and that enables you to drag that out longer, well then that's great. But if your stocking rate's not high enough, you'll probably end up with the pasture getting away on you, so that will end up dropping the energy content of your pasture, so then it's not worthwhile. You're better off removing those feeders.
Yep, good. Thank you, Tom. The next one, is there a combination of grain mixes you would recommend with high quality hay available? So either barley and lupins or beans and barley?
Well, this is a bit about out of my knowledge area, but basically you want as high energy as possible, and then you want to make sure you meet that protein requirement. So if you've got grain that's going to be really high energy, like a barley is pretty good energy and it's pretty safe as well, you might be able to get away with something like 10 or 15% lupins. So yeah, you really want to drive energy. Wheat's obviously higher energy, but it's going to be more dangerous. Yeah, it's a bit out of my expertise area, I suppose, but you just need to make sure you're meeting as high energy as possible, and then check that you've got the protein that's necessary.
Okay, great. Thank you for the question. For those that are asking, these webinars are recorded and they will be available on the MLA website at a later date, so either tomorrow or Friday. So yeah, if you do have someone or if you don't want to listen to them again, or you have someone you want to pass them on to, that's where you'll find them, the MLA website. So Tom, the next question, in a big year of late spring growth, does leaving lambs on ewes allow growth rate to stay reasonable on lower quality feed, or are you better off weaning to put lambs on better quality feed? I think you did allude to Bruce's webinar a fair bit.
Yeah, you've got to work out what you want. I mean, your lambs are going to grow better on their mums if their mums are producing milk. But there gets to a point where you've got to decide, well, am I happy to keep losing condition off my ewes and their milk production is going to drop anyway, or do I need to get these lambs off and give them some better feed? It probably depends on your system, whether you're trying to finish lambs or you're selling them to stores as well. So yeah, there's a few things to weigh up there, but they will certainly grow better on their mums if their mums are still producing milk and if that's the best nutrition that you can provide them.
Good. Thanks, Tom. Thank you for the question. The next one's a good one. For a feedlotter, what importance would you place on buying lambs that have been imprint fed while still on their mother?
This is something I wanted to investigate more, and I probably didn't do a good enough job of it last year. But I think it would have a fair amount of effect, just going off gut feel, because getting lambs to eat during those first few days is in my experience, is the hardest bit of feedlotting. So if you've got lambs that know what that feed source is and they're ready to eat it, I think that would be a huge advantage. But yeah, that's just going off my experience. I don't have the data there to say that, yeah, it's going to make this amount of difference. Sorry.
No, sorry, Tom. I'm just reading the next question. Thank you for that question. That's fine. Okay, all right, here's a bit of a technical one for you, but see how you go. So this person put some lambs onto a fresh regrowth paddock from hay, and then weighed them 3 weeks later, and they'd lost 4 kilos. A few were a bit, I can't say that word on air, not very good, so I presume they couldn't digest it very well. And they had hay there for them too. So I guess the question is, would you assume that would be the digestibility issue in the pasture?
I suppose. Sorry, I've sort of struggled to follow that a little bit. It sounds like the feed wasn't of very high quality after you cut it for hay, and they also had hay available. So yeah, it's a bit hard to know what's gone on there without sort of seeing the paddock and seeing the lambs and a few other things. Sorry, I sort of lost that one a bit.
That's fine. I think you're right, Tom. It would be hard to, without knowing a few more details, but thank you for the question anyway. All right, I think that's all we have time for this evening. There's been no more questions come through. Or just one last one, Tom, just come through really quickly. Yep. Are there any tricks to improve utilisation of dry feed?
Utilisation of dry feed. If you want growth rates off dry feed, you're going to need to provide some sort of supplement. The lambs, they're in their growth stage, they're only going to just meet their maintenance requirements, perhaps not meet their maintenance requirements and start losing weight. So to utilise dry feed, you're probably going to need to supplement, whether that's a grain or a silage or high quality hay, but they will need some sort of high quality feed to go with that dry feed. It's actually really useful using that dry feed because it means you don't have to provide them a straw or something else, but yeah, you will need to provide something that's highly digestible and high energy to get them going.
Yeah, thanks. And the question asker has just written thanks too, but good point. And Bruce just wrote in there, increased protein energy, but is it really worth utilising, which is what Tom said. So that's all. I don't think there's any more coming in. So thanks so much, Tom, for that presentation. And thanks for those questions. That's all for us for this year. We will jump back on at the end of January. So we'll give everyone a good Christmas break, and we'll see you back on at the end of January to get back into some webinar material. So thanks again, Tom, for your presentation, and good night, everyone.
Thanks, Hilary. Thanks, everyone.